Before I watched the Odyssey, my biggest worry about the film was that it seemed a bit pointless. This is a story that has been told a million times, and frankly based off the trailers, I didn't see anything new or interesting that Nolan was bringing to it, outside of it just being a big budget Nolan movie. Yeah, never mind. I was happy to be proven completely and totally wrong. And actually one of the biggest criticisms I keep hearing of Nolan's Odyssey is that it butchers the character of Odysseus. He should be a proud, cunning trickster, but Nolan has reduced him to a sad, haunted man racked with regrets. And this isn't just something that random people on Twitter have been complaining about, but even Emily Wilson, whose translation of the Odyssey was actually one of Nolan's inspirations from the film, absolutely hated this version of Odysseus. However, I don't think that Nolan was trying to make a perfectly faithful adaptation, and rather, he took this ancient story and he decided to tell it in his own voice, and focused on specific aspects of it to express some of his own ideas about guilt, violence, civilization, and the consequences of our greatest achievements. And I think that's really interesting. So in this video, I want to look at those changes, and I want to look at why I think that Nolan's biggest changes and his portrayal of the Odyssey are what really makes this adaptation work, and what made it worth making in the first place. So, the biggest change for this movie is that Odysseus regrets the sack of Troy. Rather than it purely being a glorious victory in the height of his military genius, the horse and the pillage that followed are not only portrayed as something horrifying and violent, but also as a desecration of Zeus's law, a betrayal of the very foundation upon which Greek society was built, and even the beginning of the fall of Bronze Age civilization. Nolan also isn't the first writer to look disfavorably on Odysseus' trickery at Troy. Is Virgil, the ancient Roman writer, presented Odysseus as a deceitful and dangerous figure in the Aeneid, which is largely told from the perspective of the Trojan survivors, who Virgil recast as the ancestors to the Roman people. And even later on, this tradition would have a major influence on Dante, who took Virgil's characterization of Odysseus even further in the Inferno, and he literally cast Odysseus into one of the deepest layers of hell. But I think another change between these writers' depictions of Odysseus and Nolan's Odysseus is that Odysseus knows that his legacy will be one of deceit and pillage. And a big part of this movie was him realizing this and struggling with the knowledge and consequences of what he has done. And this connects to the main theme of the story that Nolan introduces, the fall of Zeus's law. Nolan takes some actual history and reframes it a bit in his story, making it so that the historical collapse of the Bronze Age begins with Odysseus' deceit at Troy. And furthermore, he also plays to the viewer's pre-existing knowledge about the story, as most members of the audience will think of the Trojan horse as Odysseus' big stroke of genius. And the movie does little to challenge this originally, but as it goes on, it lets the horror of the sack of Troy linger in the background, and lets us know bit by bit that the Trojan horse was the spark that lit the fire that's currently burning the world of the Bronze Age down. And ultimately, I don't think it's right to say the movie looks completely unfavorably at Odysseus' cleverness, but rather it explores how the skill that Odysseus has allows him to accomplish something horrible, and it results in consequences that he didn't predict. The murder of innocents and the destruction of a grand temple to Athena herself. His intelligence and strategy directly lead to the sullying of his patron god, the very one who represents the sort of strategic warfare that Odysseus was so gifted at. But ultimately, for Nolan's interpretation of the story to work, we need to understand what exactly Zeus's law is. Throughout the movie, Zeus's law is brought up over and over, and the main definition that is given is a vague, treat others the way you want to be treated. But the original law was a little bit more specific than that. It's known as xenia in the original Greek, translated as guest friendship. Though philosophers like Plato will later describe xenia in more detail, the custom basically consists of two reciprocal norms. First, a host must provide respect and hospitality to guests, including food, baths, and gifts. Furthermore, this should be provided to any Greek guest, regardless of which city-state they come from. In fact, it was considered rude for hosts to even ask who the guests are before they eat their meal. Secondly, in return, a guest must not be a threat or a burden to their host, and they should answer questions after they eat their meal, providing news and stories of the outside world. Xenia is a heavy focus both in the film and the original poem, but how it is approached in both is quite different. In Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus receives hospitality from various people throughout his journey, and these encounters often end up revealing the characters of both the host and the guest. For example, whenever Telemachus visits Nestor and Menelaus, he's welcomed into their homes, given food and lodging, and only questioned about who he is afterwards. On the other side, we see Polyphemus completely reject the rules of Xenia, opting to just eat Odysseus' men instead of providing hospitality. But the most important example of bad Xenia actually come from guests. First off, the suitors abuse the hospitality of Penelope's household, abandoning any sense of reciprocity and devouring his food, abusing his servants, refusing to leave, and worst of all, they are a threat to the household. And secondly, before the Odyssey, Paris, that guy who started this whole war, was a guest in Menelaus' home before he abducted Helen in a huge violation of Xenia. So Xenia has always been a huge theme in the Odyssey. But while Homer's story is quite simple in how Xenia works, if you violate it, you get punished, Nolan twists this a bit, and he turns all these violations of Xenia throughout the story into symptoms of a much larger collapse. So I've talked a bit about vague complaints about the movie, but let's cover some more concrete ones from Emily Wilson. If you don't know who Emily Wilson is, she is a classicist who made a very popular and kinda controversial translation of the Odyssey, and it's a translation which Nolan himself said inspired him to make the Odyssey. Although it is worth saying that the two versions of the story don't really have that much in common. I personally harbor no ill will for Emily Wilson. I think her translation is pretty cool, and I think that people have been very cruel to her online. First for her translation, which made a lot of big decisions in the adaptation of the poem, and there's also probably a decent amount of misogyny involved with the dislike of the translation. But she's also now being talked about a lot online for her continued criticism of Nolan's Odyssey. However, I heavily disagree with a lot of these critiques in the movie, so I'm gonna respond to some of them. First and foremost, I will state that Emily Wilson is a lot more knowledgeable than I am about the Odyssey. I mean, I'm no classicist, and I'm certainly not one of the most famous ones in the world. But I'm basically just going to be defending Nolan's Odyssey on its own terms as a film, and defending how I think it does a good job of what it sets out to do. And ultimately, I think that good art criticism starts from a good faith perspective of criticizing just how well the author was able to achieve what their vision was for the story. And personally, I just got a lot out of this particular reinterpretation of the Odyssey, so I like to defend it a bit and also talk about it. Anyways, I'm also not covering literally every section of the original article as it's very long, so I'll just be responding to some parts. The whole thing is linked in the description, and I encourage you to read it all if you're interested. But here's the first quote from her. "My teenagers had a good time. Unlike some of Nolan's other films, the Odyssey is not boring, thanks to the source material, which is impossible to mess up entirely. It's a family-friendly audiovisual spectacular, like an elaborate 4th of July fireworks display, and with about the same level of narrative and emotional depth," end quote. You know, I bet somebody out there could figure out a way to properly mess up the Odyssey. Maybe make it a Minions movie or something. But seriously, I'm not sure I understand the claim that it's family-friendly. Nolan's Odyssey is pretty dour and very intense, especially in IMAX. Like, I do think that it works fine for families with kids in middle school or older, but I don't think it's a schlocky MCU-style family film like this sentence kinda seems to imply. And though the complaint about a lack of narrative and emotional depth is ultimately subjective, I will get to a more concrete breakdown of the film later, as I think the best counter-argument to this would just be going over the whole film and all the different themes and emotions that I personally got out of it. Quote, "Homer's Odysseus is a complicated man, polytropos. Whereas Matt Damon in the film, he's traumatized Jason Bourne. He's an action hero who feels bad about being an action hero. He's not that complicated." End quote. I think it's a bit unfair to act like Odysseus is as flat as an action hero who feels bad about being an action hero. I mean, being a cool action hero guy who can take down dozens of enemies in a fight and string a bone nobody else can are the things that I would most describe as classic action hero traits in the movie. And Odysseus isn't really conflicted with these skills or the soldiers and suitors that he kills at any point, so these really aren't the things he feels guilty about. Sure, he is tired of war, but the things that turned him from a pride trickster to a regretful old dude were the knowledge that he broke Xenia, the pillage that he saw happen at Troy, his betrayal of Sinon, his separation from his family, and the pain of having to watch his men all die one by one. Furthermore, he's not just traumatized throughout the whole thing. He's a man in flux who changes throughout the movie, going from a trickster to the depressed dude. While I will admit that Nolan does trim some of the trickiness from him, and I agree that I would have preferred if he had at least kept the nobody bit with Polyphemus, as that's still early on in the movie and just like a really good bit from the original story, but Odysseus is still prideful and wrathful. He still shoots an arrow in the Cyclops in anger. He still exposes himself to the siren song, and he just keeps trying to defy the gods and get his man back home. But again and again, he is punished for these actions, and it beats him down. So I think it's correct to say that this isn't the Odysseus from Homer's story. And it's fine to prefer the original, but I don't think it's fair to act like he's been condensed into a flat action hero, and certainly not Jason Bourne. Yeah. Quote, "As they say at the award shows, I was humbled to learn that Nolan has read at least the first line of my translation of the Odyssey into iambic pentameter. In at least one interview, he cited my version of the first line of the poem. Tell me about a complicated man, but I would be ashamed to have written any part of the script." End quote. Oh, ashamed to have written any part of the script. Like, the backlash torture is really overblown, but man, that's mean as hell. Like, there certainly is a place for harsh criticism. But when you aim it at a very popular, well-received, and frankly a well-crafted and creative film, it's no surprise that people will take offense to these very personal insults. Quote, in Nolan's movie, Sinon is played by Elliot Page, and far from being the bad guy, he's the film's moral center. He is recruited to the Trojan War as a plucky youngster, thanks to the evil machinations of a teenage draft dodger, Antonius, played in adulthood by charismatically slimy Robert Patterson. The main emotional arc of the film concerns Odysseus' belated realization that he is complicit in Sinon's exploitation because he failed to tell him the truth about the Trojan horse plot. Once he recovers his memory, Odysseus is racked by guilt. The film doesn't address the moral dilemmas raised by its own narrative invention, such as why it matters so much whether Batman told the whole truth to Valiant Robin, given that he would be killed instantly either way, or why the sinless Sinon wants in on the scheme. If the sack of Troy was as bad as the movie wants to suggest, Odysseus' lie to Sinon doesn't start the Trojan War, and the Trojans would presumably have taken the horse into the city anyways, as they do in Homer's Odyssey. This muddled subplot is foisted on the film in order to make Nolan's relentlessly didactic point about the contemporary Anglophone world, that the lies and xenophobia of the war on terror and Brexit began a cultural decline that is now destroying the values we hold most dear. End quote. So, why would Sinon be willing to take part of the Trojan horse plot? Well, for one, he idolized Odysseus, and two, he was also stuck on a beach for a decade. Yeah, it sounds like a good reason to me. In fact, I think it's worth mentioning that Odysseus is one of the only of the Mycenaeans who seems to feel regretful over the Trojan horse. And even then, it takes him some time to properly come to terms with his guilt over breaking Xenia. I think it's absolutely believable that Sinon would have been fine with the trick, but angry that he died without knowing the truth of the plan, as Odysseus ended up denying him agency over his sacrifice. I also honestly think that the subtext about current-day politics in the movie is actually done pretty well. It's really not that explicit, and though I do think that Emily Wilson's interpretation of the specific events that Nolan is speaking out against are likely right, I also think that the film has other clear messages through characters like Sinon. His character shows an example of a soldier that can sincerely believe in the cause he's fighting for, while still being exploited by the people sending him to war, while he also still perpetuates violence on the people that's even worse than what he's faced. Nolan's Odyssey speaks to how nationalism and militarism can lead to horrible acts of violence against others, and how this violence can then turn inwards towards the civilization that started it to begin with. The movie is interested in what happens whenever a society convinces ordinary people to participate in violence for some supposedly greater cause, and then expands it to make this violence collapse the entire society that started it. And I think this political message is one of the things that gives Nolan's Odyssey a reason to exist in the first place. Quote, Nolan's other major addition to Homer's narrative is the repeated reference to threats to our civilization from the Sea Peoples, and now debunked 19th century theory about maritime tribes who are thought to have attacked Egypt around 1200 BCE, and to have also been responsible for the roughly coeval collapse of Mycenaean Greek culture. End quote. Well, the Sea People weren't really debunked. To be clear, I'm not a historian, but from what I've read, while it is true the 19th century theories were inaccurate in labeling the Sea People as a unified mysterious force that caused the Bronze Age collapse, the Sea People themselves were very much a historical phenomena. Egyptian records describe groups under that name attacking the Eastern Mediterranean around this period. Exactly who they were, how organized they were, and what role they played in the Bronze Age collapse is still heavily debated to this day, so I think calling it a debunked theory is a little bit misleading, especially because Nolan isn't really using them to make the same claim that the 19th century historians were making. This is a movie based on an ancient legend that already mixes mythology, history, and oral tradition together, so I actually think that it's pretty cool that Nolan is able to incorporate our knowledge of the Bronze Age collapse into his interpretation. But more importantly, the Sea People also have a very specific purpose in Nolan's story. In this version of the Odyssey, these are the splintered remnants of the Mycenaean army, who are plundering and breaking Xenia across Greece, just like we see Odysseus' forces do throughout the film. Nolan's point is that this collapse was started by the Trojan horse. The treachery and violence that starts in Troy doesn't end at Troy, and Odysseus' great act of deception becomes the spark that ultimately leads to the wildfire of the Bronze Age collapse. Quote, in Nolan's Odyssey, slaughtering people with the help of trickery, technology, and weapons is presented as bad whenever the Greeks are killing the Trojans, who have violated Xenia, but good whenever Odysseus is killing the suitors, who have violated Xenia. Taking something ostensibly abandoned by Odysseus and his comrades is natural and forgivable whenever the Trojans lay claim to the horse, but unnatural and unforgivable whenever the suitors lay claim to Odysseus' palace, food, wine, and wife. End quote. I don't think this comparison works. The Trojans don't violate Xenia. They don't steal the horse from the Greeks. They listen to Sinon, who says it was an offering, and so they bring the Trojan horse inside their walls and put it right next to the temple to Athena. The film doesn't ever really present the Trojans' claim on the horse as something bad or is stealing. The suitors, on the other hand, continually violate Xenia by exploiting the household's hospitality, all while intending to do harm to said household, explicitly violating Xenia. In fact, neither of these events are actually changed all that much between Homer's original telling and Nolan's movie. These two actions have never really been presented as similar in the story, so this wasn't really a change for Nolan. And finally, Odysseus' slaughter of the suitors isn't something that is morally good in the film. While it is allowed in the original poem, in the film, due to other changes made, Odysseus is forced into exile. He can never truly return home. Quote, "Defying the gods is noble and brave whenever Odysseus blinds Polyphemus, son of Poseidon. It's stupid and greedy whenever Eurylochus eats the cattle of the sun. Deception is bad whenever Odysseus tricks Sinon or the suitors trick Telemachus, but good whenever Telemachus and Odysseus trick the suitors." End quote. This is a somewhat shallow reading of both events. First, Odysseus doesn't know that Polyphemus is the son of Poseidon whenever he blinds him, so he's not consciously defying the gods, he's just trying to escape from the den of a monster who is currently eating him and his men. And while Odysseus blinding Polyphemus isn't necessarily a bad idea, the film does portray it as a horrifying action. However, Odysseus later shooting an arrow at Polyphemus out of rage and pride is absolutely portrayed as a bad thing, and a thing that results in many of his men being needlessly killed. As for Eurylochus and the men eating Apollo's cattle, Nolan doesn't really show this as something that came from the men's weak wills and lack of respect for the gods, but rather as a desperate action that they were forced to choose. They choose to die by being punished for their own actions rather than slowly die by starvation. Finally, I think saying the deception is bad is a bit of a weak reading of what the film is trying to say. Odysseus is still a trickster who deceives people, and I don't think that anybody can blame him for not immediately announcing himself to a group of men who would then try to kill him. The deception becomes a problem whenever it breaks the laws of Xenia and whenever it harms people like Sinon or the civilians of Troy, who never committed any wrong to invite the deceit. Quote, "But the representation of Odysseus as a reluctant warlord makes a nonsense of the movie's imagined world. We are not shown that war or killing are bad, only that good men sometimes feel bad about it. A very different point. Any serious depiction of violence, ancient or modern, must show the perspectives of the victims as well as the perpetrators, and the Homeric poems easily clear the bar, but Nolan doesn't." End quote. This is probably the criticism that I understand the least. Wilson says that Nolan doesn't show us that war and killing are bad, but the movie actually spends a huge amount of time showing us this and showing us the perspectives of the victims of said violence. The most impactful scene in the movie, the siege of Troy, is a long look at how the people of Troy were victimized. The movie deliberately lingers on the consequences of what the Greeks have done. In the biggest twist of the movie, the character initially introduced as Athena is revealed to be the spirit of a Trojan woman who was martyred during the sack and who haunts Odysseus. In the film, she works as a mouthpiece for the people who were killed at Troy. Also, Circe's whole section in the movie portrays her as someone who is terrified of the violence that Odysseus' men are capable of inflicting on her, showing how Xenia is breaking down across Greece and how this violence is affecting ordinary people. Well, about as ordinary as a witch can be, but you know. And there are more scenes of the consequences of war. The village is plundered by Odysseus, the soldiers rotting in Hades, Sinon's whole storyline. These are a variety of people who have been victimized by this war. While the movie is primarily focused on Odysseus' guilt, I think it's completely incorrect to say that Nolan doesn't show the perspectives of the victims of violence. Quote, "Nolan's Odyssey lacks many of the elements that make the poem great. It has nothing convincing to say about time, memory, history, war, or about the relationship between one warrior's glorious return and the lives of his family, adversaries, comrades, friends, and neighbors. It lacks psychological, emotional, political, and ethical depth. Its narrative structure is gimmicky. The writing is abysmal. None of the characters have convincing motivation for their actions or words. There are no sex scenes, and all the food looks horrible." End quote. These are a lot of claims, and I've already responded to some of them in the previous section. But rather than continuing to go through Wilson's review point by point, I'm going to try to get to the core of all this and address a bigger question. Does Nolan's Odyssey really have nothing meaningful to say? Wilson claims it has nothing interesting to say about time, memory, history, war, all that good stuff. But I disagree, and I think the movie actually has a really clear idea tying all these things together. But before I get to that, let's take a look at how Wilson ends her review. Quote, "Despite all of this, the release of the Odyssey is still an event to celebrate. In what we are told is the streaming era, this epic is bringing audiences back to cinemas. And what we are told is a time of declining literacy and the death of the humanities, translations of the Odyssey, including mine, are flying off the shelves. Some of those who buy the book or show up in cinemas to watch Tom Holland may go on to study ancient Greek. Perhaps the film would persuade a few college administrators not to cut their literature, language, and history departments. Nolan, who studied English at University College London, where students still study the Odyssey as a first-year foundational text, is doing his best to get the general public reading again, and I am grateful." End quote. Wait, what? I can't lie, I think this is the strangest part of the article. Wilson has gone at length to explain how she believes that Nolan completely mangles a story that is evidently incredibly important to her. She calls the movie emotionally shallow, says that Nolan's Odysseus isn't complicated, says the writing is abysmal, and even says that she would be ashamed to have written any part of the script. But then she wraps up by saying that, actually, this film existing is a good thing, because people are watching the movie and are interested in the Odyssey. Now, I agree with that part, and I understand why she thinks that the reaction to the film is a good thing. I think getting millions of people interested in Homer is fantastic. But also, I don't really understand how she thinks that the movie is that bad, and simultaneously thinks that it's going to be a good introduction to the story. Because if Nolan really has produced a paper-thin spectacle that completely misunderstands Odysseus, strips away the poem's psychological and ethical depth, gives none of his characters convincing motivations, and has basically nothing interesting to say about the story, then I really don't think it would be something to celebrate. If one of my favorite things got an adaptation that I hated, and then said adaptation just so happened to sell well, I personally would not be particularly happy about it. Like, sure, Man of Steel did well, but it also poisoned the wider public's understanding of Superman for like a decade, so I guess that's where I disagree. Wilson seems to view Nolan's film as a bad adaptation that has somehow yielded good results. Well, I argue that the film is a reinterpretation of the story that, whenever paired with fantastic filmmaking, acting, and yes, some flashy fireworks, and probably too loud sound effects, but I don't know, I kinda like that, has reignited interest in a classic story. And I think that it was able to have this impact on people because it also had that impact on me. I went into this movie wondering what Nolan could even bring to the story, and I walked out blown away by how Nolan was able to interpret it and the specific parts that he drew interest to. He took those aspects that interested and built his film around them, and I think you can see that most clearly in the idea that runs through almost every major change he makes to the story. The collapse of Xenia. Perhaps the simplest example of the collapse of Xenia is through the suitors. While they have been welcomed into Odysseus' home, they also become parasites who refuse to leave, and much worse, who hold bad intentions towards the members of the household. This is what really sets them apart as villains, not just because they oppose the wishes of the good guys in the film, but because they exploit and break Zeus's laws in order to achieve their goals. And then early on in Odysseus' return journey, he and his men raid a village. A simple scene, but one that sets the stage for the later reveal that the Greeks are the Sea People. It's an important scene because it shows how the raiders don't have to be uniquely evil in order to trigger the societal collapse. They just need to treat these others transactionally, extracting what they want from the villagers and moving on. This simple, impersonal action is enough to crush this tiny village and further the collapse of their civilization. And later, we get to Circe, who is seemingly another person who violates Xenia by turning Odysseus' men into pigs. However, she only does this because she is terrified of what these men are capable of. The loss of trust in society has left her with no choice but to proactively protect herself. So whenever this reciprocal agreement breaks down, it starts a chain effect, as host can no longer trust guest, and guest can no longer trust host, furthering a cycle of violence. Polyphemus' cave is the scene that's changed the most from the poem. And though I have mentioned that I would have preferred the Nobody Exchange to stay in the movie, maybe with some slight changes, I also do understand why it was removed. As in the original story, this is where Odysseus is cursed. Poseidon seeks vengeance on Odysseus and his men for blinding his son. But in Nolan's movie, he switched this to Troy being the beginning of his downfall. Instead of Odysseus' pride being his fatal flaw, it's his cunning through which he accidentally brought his own downfall, and the downfall of the world he intended to return to. So, that spark, Troy. Why was it so bad? Why was winning a war the ultimate act of evil that literally ends the world? Well, it's because the Trojan horse was a tool of violence disguised as a gift. It co-opted the incredibly important rules of hospitality and used them in such a violent and effective way that it forever changed the way society functioned. All bets are off, there's no going back. If deceit and trickery are so powerful that they can break into a city protected by walls built by the gods themselves, then maybe there's simply no way to survive in this world without making use of deceit. And so everybody who still follows Xenia, like Odysseus' household, will only get exploited and eventually destroyed in this new world. And with the Trojan horse and the following destruction of Troy, Zeus's law begins to unravel. While the soldiers returning from Troy may make up a portion of the Sea People, that isn't the full point. The historical Bronze Age collapse was a complicated combination of plenty of factors, but the movie weaves this all together and narrativizes it. The Bronze Age collapse happens because civilization is falling apart. Civilization depends on people agreeing that there are things that you simply don't do to one another, and without these rules, everything becomes transactional. Everybody becomes a threat, and eventually the entire political order falls apart. So finally, let's answer the question of what is Nolan's Odyssey actually about? It all comes to a head at Hades. This is where Odysseus is forced to actually confront the consequences of his actions and the ensuing collapse. This is where Odysseus is forced to confront his memories of war and confront the fact that even if he does make it home, he's no longer the man he once was. It's now hard to imagine returning to the life that he left behind. And this is where I think it becomes really interesting to examine the similarities between Nolan's portrayal of Oppenheimer and Odysseus. Nolan loves to explore similar ideas in films. A father trying to return home. How the rules of society can break down. really overcomplicated sci-fi time things that are explained in massive walls of exposition. But with Oppenheimer and Odysseus, the two are brilliant men who are able to win wars with their incredible skills, but their greatest achievements have consequences that they can't escape. The very reasons that these men are worth making movies about also bring immense suffering to themselves and to the world around them. And so I don't think that the character Odysseus was just forced to be sad and haunted just because that's what Nolan wanted. Nolan didn't just make him sad because that's the sort of main character he wants to write. No, he wrote a story where Odysseus becomes haunted because of the results of his cleverness. And so finally, the conclusion of the movie. Odysseus is victorious in kicking the suitors out, but his victory is hollow. Odysseus can't stay at this home that he worked so hard to return to. He completely missed Telemachus' youth, his dog died, and his very civilization is collapsing around him. All the consequences of his very clever and very successful trick. That's all for this video. If you're interested in mythology, I'm actually developing a game based on mythologies from around the world called Mythomania on my game development channel, and I've been playing some of the gameplay in the background of the video if you noticed it. I just recently got back to posting updates on it on my other channel, so check that out if you're interested. If you like this video, then be sure to subscribe and maybe check out this response to Ben Shapiro's terrible Wake Up Dead Man review, or maybe this video essay over 9 souls in the Chinese mythology and philosophy that it's based on. But thanks for watching. Bye.